Good morning, Revolution, and welcome everybody to this week. It's been one hell of a week, and we're going to be talking about it and also things going forward this morning. Welcome, Anita. Good morning. How are you?
Thank you, Joe. Just fine. Thank you for having me.
Anita Waters from the great Buckeye, from the great state of Ohio. I don't know if you're an original Buckeye, but if not,
it's my adopted homeland.
You're an adopted.
Yeah.
That's
I'm a New Yorker. I'm a New Yorker.
Oh, okay.
Originally,
okay.
Right.
Well, I'm a transplanted New Yorker, and another transplanted New Yorker. So he's actually from Joe Biden, who is his home boy, his home state. Scott Hiley is with us on the phone this morning. Scott, good morning.
Good morning, Joe. Good morning, Anita. Good morning, Revolution.
All right.
And my adopted home is Chicago. So.
Oh, adopted in Chicago, but by way of Pennsylvania and now New York State.
Yep.
Well, we are internationalists, we're interstatists. we are the world, as they used to say. We're one growing international community, but we still live in a nation state, and we still have a, working class and people who are trying to move towards more power, state power, and eventually a socialist society. That's what we're fighting for. But we're in the middle of an upsurge now, right? And it's what's going on in Ohio, the big demonstrations in Columbus, Anita, how's that going?
Absolutely. There has been something pretty much from that Thursday night onward, pretty much every day, there's been something going on. And we've had protests all over Ohio, even the small towns like Newark nearby had 150 people on their square, and Athens had a big demonstration, of course, but Columbus has had huge demonstrations and very violent situations with the police really behaving very badly and behaving badly on videotape as well. For instance, on Saturday, the police really without warning sent tear gas and pepper spray into the crowd, and the crowd included my Congresswoman, Joyce Beatty, and a number of elected officials from the city council were in the crowd that got pepper sprayed with no warning. So they got to see it firsthand. And the Ohio State University newspaper reporters, the Lantern is their newspaper, and that's they've done a great job covering the protests at OSU in particular. And they have some dramatic video of media representatives from the Lantern being tear gassed by police without really. They said they have their media credentials out. They had Lantern clothing on, but the police just rushed them through and then tear gassed them when
they just didn't care. They just didn't care,
No,
bust
exactly.
Them. That's their custom, right? I mean,
they were angry. The police are angry and defensive and just acting out.
Well, and it's also a picture of capitalism more generally, which is, it is fundamentally unequal, and it requires the use of violence to maintain order. I mean, there are different levels of violence and different ways of deploying it, and we're seeing, a more and more extreme form now, perhaps, and I should say that people of color have been facing violence of that sort for decades and centuries. But for many people, it's an uptick. It's a kind of new unveiling of how violent the state is willing to be. But it's rooted in the way capitalism works.
Well, there's violence, and then there's violence, and there are also other forms. In fact, the main forms of consent are not explicitly violent in this society. They use cultural forms, they use alcohol, they use drugs, they use all kinds of different trappings to make it appear that you're okay. But you're right, in this situation, Black folk and Latinos have been living under occupation, you know, for, that's one of the, I met with our club in Minneapolis last night, by the way. We do have a club there, and they are very involved in the struggle. From the beginning, they were at all of the demonstrations, and they not only demonstrated, but they cleaned up after the demonstrations, you know. They were involved in the situation of when the right wing came in, you know, and committed the acts of arson, and they set up, not just our comrades, but the people in these communities set up neighborhood patrols to push the vigilantes out, you know. That's a story that I hadn't heard told, and a very important one. But here's the thing. There's been a police riot going on. Police have been rioting, you know, and this has raised the level of attention and the outrage in broad sections of society, because a lot of people are getting pepper sprayed and gassed and beat up and hit with clubs and so on and so forth. And the demands are growing. Abolish the police, defund the police, community control of the police. You know, and some people say, oh no, you can't do that. In Minneapolis, they've called for dismantling the police department. I saw in Newark, the mayor of Newark, Mayor Baraka, has put forward proposals to outlaw terrorism in the police department, outlaw racist and fascist gangs in the Newark Police Department, require the police to live in the city of New York. So, I mean, Newark, not New York, excuse me, got a little excited there. Newark is a separate state, separate city. Not a suburb of New York. Y'all from Newark, don't get mad at me now. So, where do we stand on these issues? Because there's a lot of some people are saying you have to be an abolitionist, which, you know, I kind of am. Broadly speaking, I want to abolish capitalism, you know. I want to abolish slavery. I stand with John Brown and Fred Douglass and all of that. I want to abolish sexism. But with respect to the prisons, they say, oh, if you're not an abolitionist, then you're some kind of reformist, you know. And Anita, what's our position on this issue? Let me ask more specifically, how are these demands playing out in Columbus?
Well, I think our position is that we recognize that these institutions, like the police, are really the descendant institutions from anti-Black, you know, enforcers of slavery. So, so I think we have to demand some really thoroughgoing, not even reformation, transformation of ways that societies need to keep order. I mean, every society has needs of keeping order in its society and making people feel safe. And I think there are ways to do that that don't have anything to do with police and especially armed police and the kind of things that they do. So I think in Columbus, we're continuing to make demands. There's an effort in the legislature to declare racism a public health emergency, which is a really interesting approach. And then, as far as the police are concerned, there are the police union contract expires this year, and there's going to be a lot of pressure on the mayor to make significant changes in that. There's a call for resignation of our mayor and the chief of police, who's not a very, I mean, he's very much an apologist for police brutality, Thomas Quinlan. And I looked at that this morning, and about 25,000 signatures have been generated for that demand. So, and Ohio State University faculty are demanding that the university cut ties with the police. So there's a lot of demands on different, from different angles. And I think
the people's world could use some writing on that kind of a subject. That's a really interesting development. But what about you, Scott? Are you an abolitionist or are you a reformist in favor of policing? I mean, I want to know, where do you stand? And where do you think the Communist
I am
Party should stand?
I am a communist, big C and small c, right? I believe that we need we are working for a society that is where the state in its repressive form no longer exists, where there's no need for police or for jails. In the immediate struggle, the demand that makes the most sense to me is for community control of the police, real community control, meaning that you have an elected board composed of members from every precinct in, whatever city you're dealing with, and that board decides on hiring policies, training policies, use of force policies, discipline. Communities know what their needs are, right? And we need to have structures. Like these people claim they wear badges and they claim to carry guns and use force in the name of the people. So put them under the control of the people. As far as abolition goes, the abolishing the police in a certain sense is like abolishing the capitalist class. It doesn't mean, killing them all, as some people seem to think on the right. We get accused of that. How do you say you're peaceful, but you want to abolish the capitalist class? No, you abolish capitalism. You abolish capitalists by taking away their property. Then they're just people. You abolish police by taking away all the trappings of the racist, violent police culture that is developed under U.S. capitalism.
Part of the problem is these guns and weapons. People don't want to deal with that, but it's true. Because the police claim, well, when we go into these communities, we're getting under fire by heavy artillery. And it's true. I know back where I come from, people are armed to the teeth, and you just go to the Youngstown Vindicator and type in AK-47, and you'll see pages upon pages of stories about police capturing, automatic weapons and shoulder to air missile launchers, all kinds of things. But this is because of the prevalence of the gun lobby, and the drug trafficking and all of that. And so all of these issues are interconnected. And in order to solve one, you have to solve the other. But coming back to the issue of, abolishing the police, who in their right mind can be opposed to getting rid of the armed occupation of our communities. I like the way Angela Davis handled it at the Alliance Refounding Conference last fall. She said, of course, we're in favor of that, but that doesn't mean that we're opposed to medium range and short-term measures that will move us down the road. I wrote a letter, I wrote in a note to a friend this morning, being opposed to abolishing is like being opposed to getting rid of pollution-free air. We're in favor of clean air. The question is, how do we get from a polluted state to a clean, lead-free, pollution-free, ozone-enhanced atmosphere? And there are intermediate steps that can be taken. And the most important one, I think, Scott, is, as you said, community control. If you got elected boards, you can hire, you can fire, you can defund, you can address the budget issues in a way, and the working class and people are empowered. Your neighbors are empowered. Your coworkers are empowered to do that, and that's the most important thing. But the bigger issue, let me just say this, Scott, is the state. And this week, or last week, I forget when it was, Trump tried to involve the military in domestic affairs. and the head of the Joint Chiefs apologized for it this week. Scott, there's a split in the ruling class. What's going on?
I normally downplay. I have a tendency to downplay that sort of, opposition to Trump within the ruling class, or especially in the right of the ruling class. But this is real. When you have active, high-ranking military officers publicly breaking with the president and publicly signaling initiatives that they know he will oppose, like removing changing the names of bases named for Confederate traitors, that is significant. It means that Trump's position and that of the whole cluster clique around him is very unsteady, and it's unsteady not because the ruling class is coming to its senses or whatever, but because the uprising of the people in multiple forms, elections, in the streets, the strike wave is forcing them to reckon with new political realities. We also shouldn't underestimate the fact that NASCAR outlawed the Confederate flag, or that the Southern Baptist Convention decided to retire the gavel that belonged to a slaveholder that it used at all of its conventions. These are signs of something very big underway.
Well, Anita, are these symbolic things really important? I mean, NASCAR getting rid of the Dixie flag, and are those like measures that are meant to appease the more substantial changes, in your opinion?
Well, I do think they're important. I think they send a message of solidarity. There are symbolic things, and then there are structural things. We're always talking about structural racism, and we don't see those structures so easily. They're embedded in laws or in decisions that city planners make about where to put a highway, for example. So those structural effects, it's harder to see them, but the symbolic measures that have been taken, I think, are really strong. And it really does seem to have put a wedge into the electorate, I think, or the working class about where Trump and that ilk are standing on that issue. So I think those are signs of weakening, a shrinking of that base of people who are willing to put up with that kind of overt racism. Yeah, he seems to be doubling down into a more and more of a white supremacist party, bringing the GOP into that. And I think people are getting a little bit nervous about that right now, even in their own party.
A little nervous, yeah. They need to be a lot nervous, because he ain't nothing but a Scott likes to call them neo-Confederates. And that's one way to describe them. Good old boy, good old time racist is another apt phrase. Well, Scott, it looks like your homeboy Biden is leading in the Democratic contest, at least according to the polls, by 10, 12 points. Do you think he's going to carry it all the way to the finish line?
In terms of defeating Trump?
Yeah. What else are we talking about?
I thought you were still talking about like the primaries for some reason. Which is
last time I looked, they were over.
Yeah, he's got the delegates he needs. I mean, the question for me is not, can Biden defeat Trump? Because I don't think of it in those terms. You're
not endorsing Biden, is that what you're saying?
I am endorsing and praising and expressing my joy and solidarity with the incredible and very broad uprising that is happening, and it is not Biden and Trump. It is an invigorated and militant, democratic, anti-racist sometimes anti-monopoly and anti-capitalist movement that is taking on an ultra-reactionary, fascist-leaning, or fascist threat, and that's the contest I see. Biden defeating Trump in November is part of that. Winning legislative majorities is part of it, but unless those electoral victories translate into structural changes to the way policing is done, to the way voting is conducted, things like that, unless we can actually break the power of the extreme right, the legislative victories are kind of secondary. And we need the uprising to continue on all fronts.
And we need to march, Anita, from the streets to the a ballot box. But we also, people have got to be motivated, right, to march to the a ballot box, and there have to be planks and platforms that address our needs. And by the way, Anita, on the issue of policing and abolition and community control and defunding, one of the things we need to say, right, is that the African American people's movement, Black Lives Matter, they're independent movements. They're independent movements. And we got to respect their demands. We don't get to decide for them what they should think or say. You know, they are experiencing the brunt of this iron fist of oppression coming from the state, and that has to be weighed into the calculation, don't you think?
Absolutely. That Black Lives Matter agenda, I think, is really giving leadership to some of our organizations. Our young people, for example, expressed that to me just last night. The people who are involved in the national youth movement in our party, that the Black Lives Matter agenda really is setting the tone. And it also, I mean, as far as going to the ballot box, I think that all of this activity and the fact that it's about police and about local as well as national structures, I think that is opening up the possibility for people to get even more enthusiastic about voting for levels like prosecutor or city council members and mayors and sheriffs. In some places they're elected, like in Ohio. So I think those demands will our activity will eventually motivate people to take part in all of those elections on every level. So
I think, Anita, you got the last word. We're going to have to bring it to a close there. I agree with you very much. So rather than repeat it, I'm just going to stop. And thank you very much for showing up, Scott. Have a great week. Check out cpusa.org. We got some great articles there, and keep the pressure on, right, Anita?
Right. Keep the pressure on. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Scott. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Hey, have a good weekend, comrades. Bye.
You too.